The path was very organic in that it was just a series of, without getting into too much detail, it was just a series of, we told one story and it sold, so we had a story with robots and that sold, and then we did issue 3, and I wanted to do a car chase in comics, and nobody does car chases in comics, so we did that, and that sold, and we were like, well, what are our other favorite things? We love Star Wars, so by issue 4, we sent them to outer space so we could steal everything we could from George Lucas. And so each adventure took you to another place that you hadn't thought of before. So it was really not, I look back and I think of what would I change, and in a way nothing, because it was a very natural evolution of the idea that made that story work. And that's what guides you. You want the story to make sense and connect and take everybody else as well as us on an adventure. So it's sort of, hindsight. Hindsight is 20/20. You look back and you think, well, but I think I'm pretty happy with what they were.
I think that's a good place to be, right?
Yeah.
To just be quite happy with where you're at.
Absolutely.
How much of a say did you have in the movies that came from your creation? And are you happy with the result of the films?
Yes, that's a good question, because, one of the things that Peter and I were lucky about in the early days is because we created it and we self-published and we owned it, nothing for the first 20 years was done with the Turtles that we didn't approve of or part of, have say over. The cartoons came first, and we worked on every single one of those cartoon episodes with the writers. We approved the drawings. We approved every aspect of what it was going to look like in the stories that they were going to tell. And that was even more important to us when it came to the movie, because the movie was such a big challenge, because if it didn't work as a live-action movie, the whole thing would be over, in my opinion. So making those costumes work, with Jim Henson's Creature Shop to build those costumes to make them work, that was by far our favorite. We worked with Jim Henson and Steve Barron and others. So it was such a fantastic out-of-body experience where, normally we're in a studio drawing, and then here we are on a movie set with this lighting and guys in rubber suits doing spins and flips and kicks and...
Yeah, it was like you entered your own creation.
You climbed inside your brain and went on this adventure. But no, we were very happy with the early days, of course. After 20 years, I sold my interest, and then Viacom bought them, but then they brought me back into... I consult more now on them, which is easier. Less pressure.
Less pressure.
It was. I grew up in the country in New England, in a state. It's called Maine, a bit north of New York. And on Saturday mornings they would show. On Saturday afternoons they would show these movies. Annette Furnicello and Frankie Avalon. Beach Blanket, Bingo, they would show these surfer movies, and to me that seemed like an alien planet. So they'd be singing and dancing on the beach, and Cowabunga, hang 10, dude, and what? And so when the Turtles were born, because they lived in the sewer and they were teenagers and they lived in New York, they ate pizza, but they had this surfer lingo, so they would say like Cowabunga or something.
They're quite clearly teenagers who need a teacher, right? That's one of the reasons why, they look up to people all the time. They're very silly.
Yeah.
When it's time for action, they become adults. I mean, as in they're in their prime.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering, the names that you gave them, was it to juxtapose their silly life, almost, their silly nature? Because Leonardo, Raphael, they're all like the greatest artists and greatest minds.
Yes.
And then these doofuses that live in sewers eating pizza is a juxtaposition. Is that why you chose those names?
It was actually, the names came from, not only in high school was I a geek that read comic books, and back when I was in high school and they called you a geek, it wasn't like, Big Bang Theory where it's a cool thing. You were a geek, you sat by yourself over at a table in the lunchroom alone reading your comic books. But I was also a history fan. I loved history and I loved art history, especially especially. And so I was a huge fan of Leonardo da Vinci, and actually in my graduation year in high school I did a mural at my school of a tribute to Leonardo da Vinci.
You did it.
I did. Ninja Turtles, it wasn't silly enough. American names, Doug, Bob, Steve, still not silly enough. So
It's pretty silly. It's pretty silly. Steve!
Steve,
Doug!
Cowabunga, Steve, come on! So I just said, Peter and I were talking, and I just said, what about Renaissance? I love it. How about Leonardo and Michelangelo and Raphael? And he was laughing, so we were like, thumbs up. But then we had a discussion for about 2 weeks, because he liked the name Donatello as a sculptor, but I like Bernini as a sculptor much better, so we went back and forth and finally made it up. We stayed with Donatello, but Donatello was almost named Bernini.
Wow, Bernini.
To work with DC Comics and make Ninja Turtles work with Batman. And what was your favorite villain from Batman that you had to put in your own comics? Thank you.
So it's how to work with DC and the Batman thing? As a fan of comics, when I was growing up, my favorite characters were Daredevil and Batman. I love them both because they were kind of very urban, street, use their smarts and skills. And so when we were talking about doing a crossover with DC, I was pitching them another idea, and they said, well, why don't you do Turtles and Batman? And I was like, okay. So we were very lucky that we worked with a writer named James Tinian. He's a fantastic writer, and then Freddie Williams did the artwork on it. But I still remember drawing the very first cover for issue 1 of my co-creation, the Ninja Turtles with Batman on the cover, and it was probably the biggest geek out moment I've ever had, because it was, you just never imagined that would be an opportunity. So I love that series very much. It's fantastic. Splinter. In Daredevil, they had an evil ninja clan called the Hand. We have the Foot. So I figured it would bring both those worlds together.
Do you think in creating stories, obviously you're inspired by the things that you've ingested yourself as a kid, but there's the concept of the monomyth, right? Joseph Campbell's monomyth, and how we always repeat stories. Often it suggests that it's not accidental. It comes from within us, right? In what ways does the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles reflect, if you like, sort of society and the monomyth?
Well, it's all reflective in that. What I think, like when Peter and I were writing comics that we were publishing in 84, 85, 86, catchphrases, popular themes, things that were kind of hip or cool, you sort of gravitate to that because you're exposed to it, being in that genre. So you incorporate those ideas into those stories. Sometimes they can seem very dated when you look back on them, but that continues to grow as society grows and evolves, and we learn more, and we see more, read more, exposed to more. You sort of bring those influences to your comics. When Peter and I started Turtles, I had never seen a manga. They had not yet arrived. I think they were more popular in Europe before they were popular here in the United States. When I was exposed to manga and anime, that had a huge influence on things that we were doing, storytelling-wise, character development, and those kinds of things. So it's very reflective of the times, also it's been one of my favorite things is working with other writers and artists, because they bring fresh ideas into your characters, which to me is an exciting way to take a character. You think every story has been done, and find a new path, a new adventure to tell a new story with your characters. That's exciting for all of us.
I've got a question about the Last Ronin. It's been fascinating to see the birth of the whole new universe within the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles mythos. At first, was it hard to choose which one would be the turtle to be the last alive, and how far are you going to expand this universe in terms of comic books?
what was the, which one was left? How did we choose which one was left alive?
Yeah, was it hard to choose the one would be the last alive?
Yes. No, great question. And then, when Peter and I actually came up with the idea in 1987, and that was the same year that the cartoon started, so it was pushed away. And so 20 years later, we just had never had a chance to do it. And when I was working at IDW, we were coming up with issue 100. We were trying to think of where to go next, and so I pulled out Last Ronin and expanded it and built on it to become what it's become. And to me, there was never any other choice but Michelangelo as the Last Ronin, because not only was he firstborn, the first turtle was ever drawn was Michelangelo, and also as a story, he had to go the furthest to have become the avenging angel of death, if you will, to sort of avenge his brothers, avenge his family, and finally settle this thing. He was the least likely to do that, so to me it made a more interesting story to tell of how he became this character. And then the evolution of this series was, while Tom and I built the Last Ronin universe, it was to tell one story, but as we got into drawing and creating within the Last Ronin universe, we decided it would be great to stay there longer, and so that's what we added. It was almost, as we were just finishing up the last couple issues, we decided to put that last page that had 4 new turtles and then carry the story further. So that's what we're doing. I think issue 1 just came out. We've got specific plans for this series and then a 3rd one with these new turtles, and I hope you guys like where we take it. It's going to be pretty